Hey, what's going on, guys? Today we're going to go over the game between Anish Giri and Wang Hao, played in round 9 of the Candidates tournament, in which Anish Giri gave Wang Hao a positional masterclass. So let's just jump into the game. We have d4 by Anish, knight to f6, c4, taking control of the center squares. We have e6 by Wang Hao, knight to f3, d5, striking in the center with the pawn. And here Anish goes for g3, and we have a Catalan position. Bishop to e7, bishop to g2, both players just continue to develop, and here both of them went ahead and castled. And black took on c4, and this is going to be our starting position that I'm going to begin discussing with you guys. At the moment, black is up a pawn here on c4, and there's a few ways that white can do to actually get this pawn back or handle this position. Number one is to go knight to e5, which right away targets the pawn on c4. The other move, and a very interesting one, is to go knight to a3, which also targets the pawn on c4. Now, at the top level, this knight to a3 move is not really seen because it gives black the opportunity to go ahead and remove that knight off the board with bishop takes on a3, which will damage the pawn structure for white with pawn takes on a3. Now, for the troubles, white is going to get the bishop pair, is going to have the open b file to attack with the rook on the queen side, and in reality, this pawn on c4 is likely to fall anyways. It's very hard to stop moves like queen to c2, knight to e5, both targeting that pawn here on c4. So it is a very nice move to consider. And if this knight is allowed to take on c4, it is coming to e5 very quickly, and white will have a very strong position. The other possibility is what Anish played in this game, which was to go queen to c2. Here, Wang Hao continues with a6, and the idea of this a6 move is a very clever one. Now, if queen takes on c4, then you can go ahead, play b5, this queen returns to c2, and now you can develop this bishop in this diagonal, which will put a lot of pressure in these light squares here. So that is the idea of this pawn to a6 move. And of course, Anish did not take here. He went and he played a4. Now he's threatening to take on a4 due to b5 being a bit harder to get in with the black pieces. And now black has to come up with a move. So it is very difficult. How do you develop these pieces? If the knight comes to c6, it sort of gets in the way of this bishop ever being developed. And at the moment, this bishop is a horrible piece. So what does Wang Hao do? Well, he plays bishop to d7, which is still considered part of theory. And the idea is that he still wants to come to this diagonal here, but he wants to do it in a different way. So now in this position, Anish went ahead, he took on c4, and this bishop comes to c6, and notice that it is attacking the light squares that it wants to be in this diagonal. Here, the game continued with bishop to f4. And this is another very interesting move because in a lot of situations here, white can go ahead and play moves like, for example, rook to d1, and the game can finish in a draw very quickly with bishop to d5, queen c2, bishop e4, queen c4, bishop d5. This is very well known to be a way to draw the game if white chooses to. But Anish plays this move bishop to f4. Now this bishop cannot move because if bishop to d5 happens, then the pawn on c7 hangs because both pieces are attacking there. So a very nice way to continue the game with bishop to f4. And of course, this bishop cannot move. So here, bishop to d6, challenging the bishop, and Anish goes for knight to c3, allowing this bishop to take on f4 and ruining the pawn structure on the king side. It is true that white is going to have a very good control of this square, but his king side is a little bit destroyed, which gives enough counterplay for the player with the black pieces here. The game continued with a5, and notice that this move, the idea of this move is that this knight doesn't have a lot of squares to go to. On d7, it doesn't make a really good impression. There's not, I mean, e5 and c5 are taken, and to come to b6, for then this pawn to simply go to a5 and kick it back, it's not really what Wang Hao wants to accomplish here. So instead, he played this move a5 in order to bring out the knight from a6 to b4, which looks like a very juicy square for this knight to be in. So we have a5 on the board. And here Anish continue with e3, a very strong solidifying move. Now both of these pawns are going to be protected, and this knight is going to be ready to jump to e5 at any moment. Here, after e3, Wang Hao continued with his plan of knight to a6. He wants to put his knight here on b4 and knight to e5 by Giri, offering this trade of bishops here. The game continued. Bishop takes on g2, king takes on g2, and c6 by Wang Hao. The idea is not so much to prevent this knight from jumping to b5, but the idea is to be able to get this queen out in order to put these rooks in the center. So the game continues. h3, and a super clever move by Anish, not a move that has been seen a lot, and the idea is that in some situations the king can occupy the square on h2. Queen to b6, attacking the pawn on b2 with the queen, so Anish retreats with queen to e2, protecting, and now it's also eyeing the possibility of the plan that I mentioned earlier, king to h2, and maybe bring a rook to g1 and start putting pressure on the king side here. c5 by Wang Hao. He has to strike right away in the center, otherwise then white is going to get that beautiful setup with king to h2 attacking on the king side. Here Anish goes for rook to d1, otherwise black would be able to take on d4 and damage the pawn structure. So after c takes on d4, Anish goes rook takes on d4, and here the other rook from a comes to d8, challenging the rook on d4 and d file altogether. Anish goes for rook takes on d8, queen takes on d8, and rook to d1, challenging the queen right away and asking this queen where she wants to go. And Wang Hao chooses a very beautiful square. He goes for queen to a8, and the idea is that this pawn wants to come to b5 with a discover attack on the king, and at the same time having the option to take on a4 or to keep pushing the pawn to maybe b4, asking this knight on c3 if he wants to maybe head to b5, e4, who knows. So after queen to a8, Anish goes king to g1, sidestepping any possibility of this pawn moving forward, and here knight to b4. Finally, Wang Hao is finding the correct squares for his pieces. Now this knight's ready to come to d5. The only problem that black has at the moment is that this knight on e5 is an absolute monster and is keeping a very good eye here on the square on f7. So this rook needs to be very careful where it goes, because if this queen ever reaches the 7th rank here, then it's going to be very difficult to protect all these threats. So after knight to b4, the game continued. Queen to b5, a very nice move by Anish. The idea of this move is not so much to penetrate to the queen side, but now this queen on a8 has to stay attached to the protection of these two pawns here. So knight to d5, Wang Hao wants to remove some of the minor pieces from the board, which will make his defensive task a lot easier. And at the moment, this position is absolutely equal. It's later on that Wang Hao begins to go wrong. Here, knight takes, and rook to c1. Wang Hao denied the possibility of this rook entering to the 7th rank, since the knight it's in the way, and you can't really remove this knight with moves like pawn to e4, because then you drop the pawn on f4. So Anish finds another way to get in with rook to c1. Here the game continued. h6. Wang Hao is creating some space for this king to move to, just so that he doesn't get back rank checkmated in this position. So we have queen to d7 by Anish. The queen has managed to get in, and now there's a lot of threats with ideas later on to go knight takes on f7, maybe relocating this knight back to c4, b6, who knows. This rook is coming into the square on c8 if this queen ever decides to leave the back rank. Lots of ideas with this infiltration of the queen. Not to mention, as we mentioned earlier, it keeps an eye on this square, so now this rook can no longer leave. So Wang Hao goes knight to f6, asking this queen to go, so Anish goes to d6. And the idea of putting it on d6 is that he wants to play rook to c7, attack this pawn, which queen is coming to b6, and then this pawn is going to be very difficult to handle. But not to mention, this rook is going to be tied up to this defense of the f7 square forever. So Wang Hao plays g6, and this move is the beginning of all the troubles that Wang Hao is going to find in this game. Notice that The only protection of this knight is the pawn on g7. Now that the pawn comes to g6, there's nothing else protecting this knight. And if ever this queen is able to attack that knight somehow, the only defense is going to be some king to g7, but then it's going to be forever pain, as you will see in this game. And if the knight ever leaves, then both the rook and the queen are going to be able to jump into the position. So here, after g6, Anish goes for b3. He wants to make sure this pawn is safely protected so that he can then mobilize his pieces. And Wang Hao continues with pawn to h5 and king to h2. Ideas of this move is just to get away from the back rank so there's no checks. And at the same time, he doesn't want to go to a square of h1 because he doesn't want to be in the same line as this queen. And at the same time, maybe this rook can infiltrate down the g file if ever possible. So the game continues, king to g7, and notice now that Anish is going to utilize the fact that he can put a queen in this diagonal and pin this knight to the king. So he goes queen to d4. Now there's ideas of going knight to d7, pretty much winning the game on the spot since you will be attacking both the knight and the rook. So the game continues, rook to d8, and Anish, instead of going to any other square, he continues putting pressure on the position and stays in the same diagonal. Of course, knight to d7 is not possible at the moment, but that threat is going to be permanently there, and this rook is ready to come to c7, attacking the f7 square. So Wang Hao has to prevent that, and he goes queen to b8. And here Anish continues with b4. He finds a very beautiful solution to continue to put pressure in the position. The computer doesn't really like this move, but it is a very difficult move for black to deal with. And the idea is incredibly deep, and it comes behind that after pawn takes, which happened in the game, now Anish played rook to c4. The square on c7 was denied, but he found another way for this rook to get into the game. Now the rook is going to take on b4, and it's going to take on b7, and again is going to attack the pawn on f7, which will then free up this knight to go to the square on d7 and absolutely just win the game. So here, Wang Hao played b3, Anish played rook to b4. He just wants to capture and capture. So queen to a7, he took on b3, Wang Hao took on a4, and Anish finally took on b7, and now he has full control of the 7th rank. And in this position, Wang Hao, instead of playing passive defense, which actually doesn't work, he can try rook to f8, but then just knight to d7 wins on the spot. He goes for queen to e8. And as Magnus Carlsen mentioned in the live commentary, you can go ahead and take here on f7 and queen takes and knight takes, but it's going to be very difficult to create a pass pawn, although you should be able to with a king infiltration via g3, h4, and g5 in combination with the pawns moving forward. But Anish, of course, a player of his strength, did not want to make his life miserable. Taking on f7 cannot be prevented, so he just goes rook to a7. And here Wang Hao goes for rook to d5. In some situations, there could be the possibility of taking on e5 if this queen ever comes to b7, for example. And if this knight comes to d5, who knows, a fortress could be achieved, since it's going to be very difficult to create a pass pawn here, even though you could be up a full exchange. But after rook to d5, Anish plays queen to b7 anyway, and this is a crazy idea. You cannot take this knight with the rook, because if you go for this move after rook to a8, this queen is practically trapped. The only move you have is queen to e7, but after queen to b8, you're going to get checkmated. So Wang Hao did not go for this, but not going for this just pretty much means that you're going to lose the game. And after knight to e4, Anish just took on f7, and Wang Hao threw in the towel here. There's going to be just a lot of discovered checks. Knight to g5, knight to e5. This king is going to get checkmated, and Wang Hao resigned the game. And this means that Anish is only half a point behind, and it looks like a 3-player race for first place with Nippo, Caruana, and Anish Giri. And it's going to be an exciting few rounds to go in the candidates tournament. And as always, stay safe, have a great day, show respect to your opponent. See you on the next video.